The Lockheed Electra descended through the desert darkness, its engines humming against the vast emptiness of the Mojave. Inside the aircraft, three Soviet security officers sat rigid in their seats, their faces illuminated by the occasional flash of starlight through the cabin windows. They had crossed an ocean and a continent. These men trained to see threats in shadows, to read deception in every gesture. But nothing in their extensive training, not the rigorous courses at the higher school of the KGB, not the countless briefings on American society, not even the propaganda films they had studied frame by frame, could have prepared them for what awaited below. As the aircraft bank left for its final approach to McCarran Field, one of the agents, Major Yuri Nosenko, pressed his face against the cold glass. What he saw defied the laws of nature as he understood them. Rising from the absolute blackness of the desert floor was a constellation of light so brilliant, so impossibly concentrated, that for a moment he wondered if his eyes were deceiving him. The strip blazed like a river of fire cutting through the void, neon signs 10 stories tall, spelling out names and colors that didn't exist in Moscow, searchlights piercing the sky in geometric patterns, thousands upon thousands of lights creating an artificial dawn at midnight. The other agents crowded to the windows, their professional composure cracking. They had been briefed on Las Vegas. They had seen photographs. But photographs were lies, pale, inadequate translations of a reality that seemed to violate every principle of Soviet resource management and collective restraint. The year 1959 marked a peculiar moment in the Cold War, a brief thaw in the permafrost of superpower relations. Nikita Khrushchev, the rotund and mercurial leader of the Soviet Union, had accepted an invitation to visit the United States, the first Soviet premier to set foot on American soil. It was a journey conceived in mutual suspicion and diplomatic necessity, a 13-day tour designed to showcase American openness while allowing Soviet eyes to assess the true strength of their ideological enemy. Accompanying Khrushchev was a carefully selected delegation of officials, journalists, and security personnel, men chosen for their loyalty and their ability to see through capitalist illusions. The KGB agents aboard that flight were not tourists. They were professional observers, trained to catalog American weaknesses, to identify the rot beneath the glossy surface, to gather intelligence that would prove the inevitable collapse of the capitalist system. But Las Vegas was not part of the official itinerary. The Soviet delegation was scheduled to visit Los Angeles, where Khrushchev would tour a film studio and deliver speeches about peaceful coexistence. Las Vegas was merely a refueling stop, a technical necessity on the long flight from San Francisco. American officials had not planned any events in the gambling capital. There would be no formal reception, no carefully staged demonstrations of American life. This was precisely what made the moment so dangerous, so revelatory. For perhaps the first time on their journey, the Soviet visitors would see America unfiltered, unscripted, raw. The aircraft touched down at 11:47 p.m., and as the engines powered down, the agents gathered their briefcases and prepared for a routine layover. They expected a quiet airport, perhaps a small terminal building, maybe a few maintenance workers. What they encountered instead was sensory overload on a scale that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity. Even the airport glowed. Slot machines lined the terminal walls, their bells ringing in chaotic symphony, their lights flashing red and gold and electric blue. Travelers in evening wear stood feeding quarters into these machines with mechanical persistence, their faces blank with concentration or twisted in sudden joy. The agents had been taught that gambling was a symptom of capitalist decay, a predatory system that exploited the desperation of the working class. But these people didn't look desperate. They looked entertained. Major Nosenko, who would later defect to the United States in 1964, recorded his impressions in a diary that remained classified until the 1990s. His words carry the weight of genuine confusion. We emerged from the aircraft expecting darkness and silence. Instead, we walked into what seemed like a city that had declared war on night itself. The temperature was perhaps 30 degrees Celsius, but the heat seemed to come not from the desert, but from the lights themselves, as if they generated their own climate. My colleague Dmitry asked if there was a celebration, some national holiday we had not been informed about. Our American liaison simply smiled and said, "This is Tuesday." The Soviet security detail had 90 minutes before the aircraft would be refueled and ready to continue to Los Angeles. Standard protocol dictated that they remain at the airport, maintain security perimeters, avoid unnecessary contact with American civilians. But the American liaison officer, a young State Department attaché named Robert Morrison, made a suggestion that would violate every principle of Soviet operational security. He offered to drive them down the strip, just a quick tour, 15 minutes there and back. The agents exchanged glances. They should refuse. They should remain at their posts. But the lights visible through the terminal windows exerted a gravitational pull that seemed to override training and discipline. 3 black Cadillacs departed McCarran Field at 12:10 a.m., carrying 9 Soviet security officers into the heart of American excess. As they turned onto Las Vegas Boulevard, the world transformed. The Sands Hotel rose before them, its sign a cascade of falling stars rendered in neon and incandescent bulbs. Across the street, the Sahara's minaret glowed against the darkness, while further down the strip, the Stardust announced itself with a sign so large it could be seen from aircraft at 10,000 feet. Each casino competed for attention with increasingly baroque displays of light and motion, rotating signs, chasing lights, animated sequences that told stories in pure luminescence. What struck the Soviet observers most profoundly was not merely the quantity of light, but its purpose. In Moscow, in Leningrad, in every Soviet city, light was rationed, conserved, deployed with careful consideration of electrical resources and collective need. Street lamps were spaced at intervals calculated for maximum efficiency. Building facades remained dark after sunset to preserve power for industrial production. Even the illumination of Red Square was modest by comparison. A few floodlights on the Kremlin walls, the red stars atop the towers glowing with revolutionary symbolism but practical restraint. But here, in this desert city built on sand and speculation, electricity seemed to flow without limit or conscience. The casinos burned kilowatts the way Soviet citizens burned candles, freely, wastefully, as if the very concept of scarcity was a foreign language. The Flamingo Hotel, which they passed at 12:17 a.m., featured a sign that used 15 miles of neon tubing and it consumed enough electricity to power a small Soviet town. This single piece of commercial advertising drew more power than the entire residential district of Nosenko's childhood neighborhood in Kiev. The Golden Nugget downtown used over 2 million light bulbs in its facade alone. The Dunes Casino employed a 35-foot-tall Sultan statue that rotated continuously, its jeweled turban flashing in patterns programmed by primitive computer systems. Every hotel, every casino, every restaurant competed in an arms race of illumination that would have been considered criminally wasteful in any Soviet context. Inside the Cadillacs, the conversation had ceased. The agents simply stared, their analytical training temporarily suspended by the sheer magnitude of what they were witnessing. They had been taught that American capitalism was a system of exploitation, that beneath the surface, glamour lay poverty and desperation, that the wealth of the few was built on the suffering of the many. But where were the poor? Where were the bread lines they had been told existed in every American city? The sidewalks of the Strip were crowded with people in expensive clothing, laughing, drinking, moving from casino to casino with the casual confidence of those who had never known hunger or shortage. Lieutenant Viktor Petrov, sitting in the second vehicle, had been taking notes in a small leather journal, documenting everything he saw for his official report. But as they passed the Tropicana, with its massive fountain and acres of landscaped gardens maintained in the middle of the Mojave Desert, he stopped writing. How could he explain this to his superiors? How could he describe a society so wealthy that it could afford to waste millions of gallons of water on decorative fountains in a desert simply to create an atmosphere of luxury? In his hometown of Volgograd, water was rationed during summer months. Here, it shot 50 feet into the air for the entertainment of gamblers. The motorcade stopped at a red light near the Desert Inn, and in that moment of stillness, Petrov made a decision that would haunt him for years. He opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. His superior officer barked an order to return, but Petrov was already moving toward the entrance of the Dunes Casino, drawn by the sound of music and the promise of understanding what existed beyond the glass doors. The interior of the Dunes Casino, circa 1959, was a cathedral dedicated to chance and abundance. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted to resemble desert skies at sunset. The carpet beneath Petrov's feet was so thick it seemed to absorb sound, creating an acoustic bubble where the only noises were the mechanical songs of slot machines, the click of roulette wheels, the shuffle of cards, and the constant murmur of human voices engaged in the ancient ritual of wagering. The air was cool, artificially cooled to a temperature that would have been considered luxurious in any Soviet building, and carried the mingled scents of perfume, cigarette smoke, and something else, something Petrov couldn't immediately identify. It was the smell of money, of paper bills handled by thousands of hands, of coins cycling through machines in endless repetition. What Petrov noticed first was the food. At the center of the casino floor stood a buffet table that stretched for what seemed like 50 meters. It was 12:30 in the morning, well past any reasonable dining hour, yet the table groaned under the weight of more food than Petrov had seen in one place in his entire life. There were pyramids of shrimp on ice, each crustacean the size of his thumb. Roasted meats glistened under heat lamps. Beef, pork, chicken, turkey, ham. Salads of every conceivable variety filled crystal bowls. Desserts rose in architectural complexity. Cakes, pies, pastries, each one a small work of edible art. Fresh fruits that had no business existing in a desert. Pineapples, mangoes, strawberries the size of small apples, cheeses from a dozen countries arranged on marble slabs, bread baskets overflowing with rolls still warm from the oven. And standing before this abundance were perhaps 30 people, ordinary Americans in casual dress, loading plates with portions that would have fed a Soviet family for a week. A construction worker in denim and work boots piled his plate with prime rib. A secretary in a modest dress selected lobster tail with the casual indifference of someone choosing between apples at a market. An elderly couple debated whether to try the crab legs or the scallops, ultimately deciding on both. But here was the detail that broke something fundamental in Petrov's understanding of economic systems. The buffet cost $1.99, less than $2 American for unlimited access to this cornucopia. He had been taught that such abundance was impossible under capitalism, that the profit motive would prevent such generosity, that American workers struggled to afford basic nutrition. Yet here were working-class Americans. He could tell by their clothing, their accents, their casual manner, eating like aristocrats for the price of a loaf of bread. The other agents had followed Petrov into the casino, their security protocols abandoned in the face of anthropological fascination. Major Nosenko approached the buffet and stood watching a middle-aged woman in a simple cotton dress pile her plate with lobster tail, prime rib, and 3 different types of salad. When she noticed him staring, she smiled and said something in English. The American liaison translated, "She says the desserts are even better. She recommends the cheesecake." Nosenko nodded mechanically, unable to formulate a response. In his briefcase, he carried a report he had written 3 days earlier in San Francisco, a detailed analysis of American economic weakness and the inevitable crisis of overproduction that would bring capitalism to its knees. Standing in this casino at 12:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, that report seemed to belong to a different universe, one governed by different physical laws. The symbolic power of that buffet, repeated in every casino on the Strip, in every hotel, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, represented something more profound than mere abundance. It was a statement about values, about priorities, about what a society chose to do with its resources. Soviet ideology held that capitalism was inherently wasteful, that the pursuit of profit led to artificial scarcity and controlled distribution. But here was a system so productive, so efficient at generating wealth, that it could afford to waste food on a monumental scale as a marketing strategy. The casinos lost money on the buffets. They knew this. They planned for it. The food was bait, a loss leader designed to keep gamblers in the building, to create an atmosphere of generosity and plenty that would encourage risk-taking at the tables. One of the younger agents, Captain Alexei Volkov, approached the buffet attendant and asked through the translator how much food was thrown away each night. The attendant, a cheerful man in his 50s, estimated that each major casino discarded between 300 and 500 pounds of prepared food daily. Volkov did the mathematics in his head. The Strip had approximately 15 major casinos. That meant somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 pounds of food, perfectly edible, carefully prepared food, went into garbage bins every single day. In his hometown of Smolensk, such waste would have been considered not just inefficient, but criminal, a betrayal of collective resources that could feed hundreds of families. Yet here was the paradox that Volkov could not resolve. This waste was not a symptom of failure, but of success. The American system was so productive, generated wealth so efficiently, that it could afford spectacular waste as a form of advertisement. The buffet was not about feeding people. It was about demonstrating abundance, about creating an atmosphere where anything seemed possible, where the normal rules of scarcity and conservation did not apply. And it worked. The casinos were full. The slot machines rang continuously. Americans gambled not from desperation, but from entertainment, risking money they could afford to lose in pursuit of excitement rather than survival. Lieutenant Petrov, standing at the edge of the casino floor with a plate of food he had been given by an enthusiastic buffet attendant, watched a cocktail waitress deliver free drinks to gamblers at the blackjack tables. Free drinks, free food, free entertainment in the form of lounge acts and showgirls. The casino gave away everything except the one thing people came for, the thrill of risk, the possibility of winning. And people paid for that possibility not because they were forced to, not because they had no other choice, but because in a society of abundance, experience became more valuable than things. This was the insight that would trouble Petrov for the rest of his life. Soviet ideology promised material abundance through collective ownership and central planning. But here was capitalism, supposedly the system of exploitation and artificial scarcity, delivering abundance so complete that people sought meaning not in acquiring things, but in the experience of potentially acquiring more things. The buffet was not the end goal. It was the baseline, the minimum expectation, the starting point from which real entertainment could begin. Major Nosenko, who had been observing a craps table where hundreds of dollars changed hands with each roll of the dice, turned to his colleagues and said something in Russian that the American liaison did not translate. But the tone was clear. Not condemnation, not analysis, but something closer to wonder mixed with a deep, unsettling confusion. These were men who had devoted their lives to a system that promised future abundance through present sacrifice. And here, in this desert city dedicated to vice and excess, they confronted a system that delivered present abundance as casually as Moscow delivered propaganda. The American liaison, Robert Morrison, noticed the silence that had fallen over the Soviet group. He was young, perhaps 28, a career diplomat who had studied Russian at Georgetown and spent 2 years at the embassy in Moscow. He understood what these men were experiencing, though he could never fully articulate it in his reports. He had seen the same reaction from other Soviet visitors: the initial skepticism, the search for hidden poverty, the gradual realization that what they were seeing was not an elaborate deception, but simply normal American life. Morrison had grown up in Ohio, the son of a factory worker, and he remembered his father taking the family to a steakhouse buffet every Sunday after church. It had cost $3.50 per person, and his father, who made $70 a week, considered it an affordable luxury. Morrison had never thought of that weekly buffet as political, as ideological, as a weapon in a global conflict. But standing in the Dunes casino watching Soviet intelligence officers confront unlimited shrimp, he understood that everything was political, that the simple act of offering cheap food to ordinary people represented a statement about systems and values more powerful than any missile or satellite. Captain Volkov approached Morrison and asked, through halting English supplemented by hand gestures, about the people at the buffet. Were they wealthy? Were they party members? Were they specially selected to create an impression? Morrison shook his head and explained, as best he could, that these were ordinary people: secretaries, construction workers, salesmen, housewives, who had driven to Las Vegas for a weekend of entertainment. Some had saved for months. Others came regularly, perhaps once a month, treating gambling as a form of recreation rather than desperation. The average American worker, Morrison explained, earned approximately $90 per week. A weekend in Las Vegas, including hotel, food, entertainment, and gambling, might cost $50. It was affordable for the middle class, accessible to the working class, a luxury that had become democratized through mass production and efficient distribution systems. Volkov listened to this explanation with the expression of a man trying to solve an equation that violated mathematical principles. In the Soviet Union, luxury was reserved for the party elite, for those who had demonstrated loyalty and service to the state. The idea that ordinary workers could afford luxuries, that capitalism would make abundance accessible to the masses rather than hoarding it for the few, contradicted everything he had been taught. And yet here was the evidence, undeniable and immediate. Working-class Americans eating lobster at midnight in the middle of a desert. The motorcade departed the strip at 1:15 a.m., the agents settling back into their seats in silence. They had violated protocol, abandoned their posts, allowed themselves to be seduced by enemy territory. But more than that, they had seen something that could not be unseen, learned something that could not be unlearned. As they drove back toward the airport, Major Nosenko stared out at the receding lights and understood that he was carrying back to Moscow not intelligence, but doubt. Not certainty, but questions that had no acceptable answers within the framework of Soviet ideology. The official report filed by the security detail made no mention of the buffet, no description of the abundance, no acknowledgement of the psychological impact of their Las Vegas encounter. It focused instead on security procedures, crowd control, potential vulnerabilities in the American protection detail. But in private conversations, in the coded language that Soviet officials used when discussing uncomfortable truths, the Las Vegas experience became a reference point, a shared secret that carried implications too dangerous to speak aloud. In the months and years that followed, several of the agents who witnessed Las Vegas that night would begin to express private doubts about Soviet economic policy. Nosenko would defect to the United States in 1964, citing not ideology, but a growing sense that the system he served could not deliver on its promises. In his debriefing sessions with the CIA, he would mention the Las Vegas buffet repeatedly, describing it as the moment when his faith in Soviet superiority began to crack. Petrov would become an advocate for economic reform, arguing in internal KGB memos that the Soviet Union needed to study American methods of wealth generation, not just American military capabilities. His suggestions would be ignored, filed away in archives that would remain sealed until the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Volkov would request reassignment away from intelligence work, unable to reconcile what he had seen in Las Vegas with what he was required to report about American economic decline. He would spend the rest of his career in administrative positions, never again traveling outside the Soviet Union, but never forgetting the sight of ordinary Americans eating shrimp at midnight for less than the cost of a movie ticket. The broader implications of this encounter rippled through the Soviet intelligence community in ways that remained classified for decades. The KGB maintained extensive files on American economic conditions, tracking unemployment rates, inflation, labor disputes, anything that might indicate capitalist crisis. But Las Vegas existed outside these metrics. It was a city that should not exist, that violated every principle of rational economic planning, yet thrived precisely because it embraced irrationality, excess, and waste as business strategies. The symbolism of Las Vegas, a city built on sand, sustained by vice, powered by excess, represented everything Soviet ideology condemned about capitalism. It should have been easy to dismiss as decadent, corrupt, doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But the agents who saw it that September night understood something that would take Soviet leadership another 30 years to fully comprehend. Las Vegas worked. Against all principles of rational planning, against all predictions of capitalist crisis, this absurd city in the middle of a desert not only survived but thrived, drawing millions of visitors who came willingly, eagerly, to participate in an economic system that offered them the freedom to win or lose based on chance and choice. The Cold War, that great ideological contest between competing visions of human organization, was not won or lost on battlefields or in missile silos. It was won in moments like this, when the lived reality of one system confronted the theoretical promises of another, when the abundance of the buffet table spoke louder than 1,000 propaganda speeches. Those KGB agents who froze in awe before the lights of Las Vegas understood, perhaps before their leaders, that they were witnessing not just American excess, but American success. The success of a system that, for all its flaws and inequalities, had managed to create wealth on a scale that made even waste abundant. The buffet table became, in the private mythology of those who witnessed it, a symbol of everything the Cold War was truly about. Not nuclear weapons or space races or proxy wars in distant jungles, but the fundamental question of which system could better provide for ordinary people, which ideology could transform the abstract promise of abundance into the concrete reality of shrimp and lobster available to anyone with $2 in their pocket. Soviet propaganda spoke of a future paradise where all would share equally in collective wealth. American capitalism offered a present reality where inequality persisted but abundance cascaded down through economic structures until even the working class could afford luxuries that Soviet elites might envy. The epilogue to this story is written in the ruins of the Soviet Union and the continued existence of Las Vegas, which today burns even brighter than it did in 1959. The lights that stunned those Soviet agents now consume enough electricity to power a city of 1 million people. The buffets have grown larger, more elaborate, more wasteful. The Bellagio's buffet features over 500 items. The Wynn offers live cooking stations where chefs prepare made-to-order omelets and pasta dishes. The Bacchanal buffet at Caesar's Palace seats more than 600 people and serves over 15,000 guests daily, each paying approximately $60 for unlimited access to foods from 9 different cuisines. And people continue to come, not because they are forced to, not because they have no choice, but because Las Vegas represents something fundamental about human nature that Soviet planners never understood. The desire not just for material comfort, but for possibility, for the freedom to risk, to choose, to experience abundance not as a distant promise, but as an immediate, tangible reality. Those KGB agents returned to Moscow carrying this knowledge like contraband, a dangerous truth that could not be shared in official reports but could not be forgotten in private thoughts. In the end, they had been sent to observe and report on American weakness. Instead, they had witnessed American strength in its most undeniable form, not military might or technological superiority, but the simple, devastating fact of abundance offered freely to anyone willing to pay the price of admission. The lights of Las Vegas did not just illuminate the desert. They illuminated the fundamental difference between a system built on scarcity and control and one built on abundance and freedom. A difference that would ultimately prove decisive in determining which vision of humanity would survive into the next century and which would fade into history like a neon sign at dawn, beautiful in memory but powerless against the rising sun of economic reality. The buffet table, that humble symbol of American excess, had accomplished what no diplomatic summit or propaganda campaign ever could. It had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of true believers, doubts that would grow slowly but inevitably, until the entire edifice of Soviet certainty crumbled under the weight of questions that began with shrimp and ended with the fundamental nature of human aspiration and economic organization.